Okay, well, good evening and welcome to everybody. Welcome to our regulars, and if you're a first timer with us this week, welcome to you as well. My name is Alan Friedman. I'm Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association. Also visible on your screens are David Adler, who's President of the AJA, as well as our guest for tonight, Peter Kurti, who we will introduce formally in a moment. Tonight's topic is one we are all unfortunately familiar with, and that is left-wing anti-Semitism, and I guess there's just a lot of it around as usual. The format will be pretty much as before. David and I will speak to Peter for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience. The way to ask a question, if you're not familiar with Zoom, is to electronically raise your hand. The way you do that is click on the reactions icon at the bottom and you'll see little pictures. If you click on the hand, that sends us a message, and then we put you in the list to ask questions. The chat function is available as usual, and as usual, we just ask that people stick to tonight's topic on the chat. Now, a couple of weeks ago, Julian Burnside QC developed a serious case of anti-Semitic foot and mouth disease when he tweeted that Israel's action towards the Palestinian Arabs mirrored what the Nazis did to the Jews. Burnside's wife tried to mitigate the damage, but only made things worse. This prompted Federal Minister for Education and Youth, Alan Tudge, to write a very good article on left-wing anti-Semitism for The Australian. But our guest tonight has been well ahead of him on this issue and was in fact drawing attention to it back in 2019, where in a policy paper for the conservative-leaning Centre for Independent Studies, he argued that anti-Semitism, whilst long part of human history, has mutated into a new toxic form among the postmodern left-wing political class. Peter Kurti is also Adjunct Associate Professor in the School of Law at the University of Notre in Australia, and Adjunct Research Fellow at the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture at the Charles Sturt University. Peter, welcome to the AJA and thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you, Alan. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to hand over to David to kick off the session, so take it away, David.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you, Peter, for joining us this evening. Peter, can you start by telling us why you did that project for the CIS? And by the way, after the event in our next email that goes out, we will send a link to the major work that you did for the Centre of Independent Studies. So why did you do it?
Well, anti-Semitism has been a subject that has been of not just intellectual concern, but emotional concern to me for a long time. My history is that I was born in England to a Gentile mother, but a Jewish father. And my father had been a refugee from Nazism. He left Vienna in 1938. His younger sister, and they're both deceased now, but his younger sister left a few months before. When my father left Vienna at the age of 16 and was evacuated to Palestine, it was the last time he saw his parents, who subsequently died. We are pretty certain that they died in 1942 in Mali Trostenetz. And so I've been aware, even as a young child, that I had a Jewish component to my identity. My father was a secular Jew, not in the least bit religious. It's perplexing to a number of people, sometimes to myself included, as to why I ended up as a Christian minister. I ended up as an Anglican. My father took also a very keen interest in my religious life, but my sense of a Jewish heritage has been with me ever since I can remember. And so I've been alert to the ways in which Jewish people, Jewish life and culture, and the state of Israel has been perceived in the secular societies in which I've lived, that is to say, in England and in Australia. And left-wing anti-Semitism in particular caught my attention here, largely, I think, because of the activity of one man, and that was former Premier Bob Carr, right, who had been such a solid and staunch friend of Israel, and then turned and changed in a way that I thought was startling and perplexing, it's a change that has never been fully explained, although people have their theories. And he has never really justified the change in his position. So that's been a long-running thing with me over the last number of years. Then I think it became a very pressing issue with the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leadership of Jeremy Corbyn in England. And that seemed to be a real catastrophe, actually, because the Labour Party in Britain had been for long had been sort of a conventional home for British Jewry. Both of my parents, my father and my aunt, were both solid Labour people, and the Labour Party was their natural home, their natural political home. And then to see the character of the Labour Party so egregiously and dangerously distorted by the antics of Jeremy Corbyn really made me feel this is an issue that I need to look at in greater depth, and that's what prompted me.
Peter, it's not just the Corbyn phenomenon, but you've commented also, and we've observed that on the left of politics, perhaps not as dramatic as Corbyn in Australia, but we've seen some elements, some endorsed Labor candidates were disendorsed at previous federal elections. The Greens have a reputation. In the US, there seems to be a real issue in the Democrat Party. So what are your observations about the political landscape generally with regard to anti-Semitism?
I think it's changing because of the rise of, in the broader sense, of identity politics and the ideology that underlies identity politics. In the 60s and 70s, there was, and it really goes back to the early years after the Second World War, when former colonies of the British Empire and other empires began to seek their own identity and their political independence. I think that momentum grew in the 60s and 70s to the extent that colonialism was seen as a bad thing, an unremittingly bad thing. And so I think there grew to be an awareness, which we're seeing now in a very activist form, that all forms of colonialism needed to be resisted, that in the name of justice, economic and social equality could only be pursued by dismantling power structures that were deemed to be oppressive and corrupting. And I think this really took off in particular on the left. And we've seen it in the United States, we see it here, and we've seen it in the United Kingdom. And I think that is really how the left got captivated by the idea that all forms of colonialism or oppression needed to be fought, needed to be overturned, and needed to be resisted. And of course, as we know, tiny Israel, a beacon of democracy in the Middle East and a vibrant democracy at that, has been the particular focus of the ire of the anti-colonialists, who see that this is that for them, Israel represents everything bad, everything toxic about colonialism, and so I think that's why it's attracted in particular an egregious amount of criticism. So
Israel has become the fashionable veil of the bigotry of anti-Semitism. The racism is no longer PC, so we put Israel in between, and that's something that you've written about considerably as well, isn't it?
It is, and I think what's interesting about this left-wing form of anti-Semitism, because as you said and you and Alan said in your opening remarks, anti-Semitism is something that just like a virus, it mutates. And Alan Tudge said this in that piece in The Australian that Alan referred to, that the anti-Semitism of the right, in broad terms, is something that happens at night. It happens in the dark. Jewish cemeteries are desecrated at night. Swastikas are daubed at night. For the most part, it's done in darkness, without any kind of claim to intellectual respectability. The left-wing anti-Semitism is very different. It happens in broad daylight. It happens on our university campuses. It happens under our very noses, and is something that that claims for itself an intellectual respectability, which makes it, I think, harder, but no less important to counter. And the instance of Julian Burnside is a very good, recent and timely example. I mean, I don't know Burnside, but he's clearly an intelligent man and an accomplished lawyer, but speaking from what can only be described as pitiable ignorance, because he admitted in correspondence with Gerard Henderson that Gerard published that he had never been to Israel. He got all his news from the ABC and the SBS. So his ideas about the tyrannous government of Israel and its treatment of the Palestinians was filtered through left-wing media. So there's no attempt in this instance, but Burnside is just an example. There's no attempt to filter that information, to ask whether to test the claims and to see whether in fact they do stand up. These charges stand up. Instead, it's fashionable and in many ways and in many circles acceptable simply to spout this stuff and not to expect to be challenged. And I think Burnside was taken aback probably by the extent to which he was challenged with great vigor.
Yep. Peter, in addition to the political level, there is an institutional problem. There are a number of institutions that are left of centre. You touched on a couple. The university campuses, many of the academics have quite strong left of centre views. The ABC has a very deep history of at least an anti-Israel bias, which we would say does cross the line into anti-Semitism according to the IHRA definition. And some of the NGOs that are the sort of human rights focused NGOs also seem to have combined. Can you talk a little about that tier of activity, those sort of institutions?
You've named all the principal culprits, many of the principal culprits, and those are the institutional voices that tend to dominate in discussion such as it is. And what I think is particularly disturbing about the universities and the NGO sector is that their criticism of Israel is, which in my view does frequently, and we can come back to this, it does cross the line. It offends against the IHRA definition, but they cloak their arguments in moral terms. So that it's not just about, in fact, I mean, it's not just about, if I may use this rather angular phrase, it's not just about, good old Jew hatred. It's about justice for the Palestinians. It's about equality and about correcting historic wrongs. So they cloak themselves in the mantle of morality, and because of that, many people who don't think very much about these sorts of questions accept the positions that they are given by NGOs and by the universities, because they claim a degree of intellectual respectability.
There's an interesting little joke going around at the moment that we know Ben & Jerry's, we see it in some of the leftist corporate organisations as well. Ben & Jerry's decided to take a stand and ban the sale of their products in certain parts of Israel, Judea, Samaria. So the question is, Peter, do you think we'll see Ben & Jerry's ban the sale of their product in Afghanistan now that the Taliban is in charge?
That's a very good question. That's a very good question. Yes, it's one wonders how it is that a democracy like Israel can attract so much criticism from people who fall silent when confronted with tyrannous regimes, many of which are Islamic, which have no regard for the rights of women, no regard for the rights of LGBTI people, but yet they fall silent. Somehow this is just deemed not an area that needs to be criticized. Far easier to criticize Israel, far easier to deny the sale of ice cream in the so-called occupied territories than to address the sale in Afghanistan. We'll have to wait and see, David. We'll have to wait and see.
Okay. I know Alan's got a couple of questions for you as well. So, Alan, do you want to ask yours now?
Thanks, David. Peter, I just want to backtrack a little bit, and then I'll ask you a question that's general and then something specific. Over the last 20 years or so, we've seen a sharp uptake of so-called progressive issues, obviously climate change, gender, intersectionality, all that stuff. So is leftism now the religion of the times? And if so, why now? What happened in the last couple of decades to sort of change this whole way of thinking?
That's a really good question, Alan. The ideology that lies behind all this, the intellectual framework, perhaps is a kind of way of putting it, that lies behind these developments is critical theory. And critical theory, which has had a long history of mutation and began in the 30s and 40s, but then has changed its shape and changed its form in the post-war years, in the 60s and 70s, and then most recently in the 21st century. Critical theory is, in essence, concerned with identifying patterns of oppression and identifying people who are victims of oppression and seeking to correct the injustice of that oppression. And so it's in terms of race, in terms of gender, post-colonial theory arises out of that there are structural injustices that critical theorists deem have to be addressed and have to be corrected. And what we've seen in the last 10 or 15 years is a particularly activist form of critical theory, where people aren't just prepared to debate these things in common rooms and lecture rooms, but feel they actually have to take to the streets and campaign, or just take to social media and campaign more aggressively in order to pursue the causes that they have identified. So gender, race, colonialism, which is one of the reasons why I think Israel is now a particular focus, because it's not just colonialism, but so-called settler colonialism, which is deemed to be deeply genocidal, even if Israel isn't aware of this, if its intention to commit genocide. Settler colonialism it carries the charge of genocide. It all comes out of a way of seeing the world, which is about structures which oppress some and allow others to oppress those people.
Now, you've written about postmodern anti-Semitism, and you've mentioned the United States, and you've referred to the Squad. Now, listening to them, and that's mainly AOC and Omar, it seems that they're totally uneducated about Israel, but that doesn't seem to worry them at all, or in any way. And we're seeing now that there's two things: there's my truth and your truth. But how can this absence of critical analysis just go unchallenged by so many people, especially in the media?
Well, I think the reason is that it's hard to challenge, or rather that challenges get drowned out, is that these critics are able to command the media and command, as it were, the moral high ground in a way that defenders of Israel find it harder to do. I don't know why that is. I think it strikes a chord with people because they don't have to think deeply about the history or the political reality on the ground when it comes to Israel and the Palestinians. I think their passion is fired. This is the people who listen to the proponents. Their passion is fired by this sense of injustice and the cause that they want to pursue. But you're right. I mean, I think it's not just the Squad, and Ilhan Omar, in my view, is a particularly dangerous person. But critics, or rather left-wing defenders of Israel here and in the UK, are easily provoked to furious anger if they are challenged. And I think that anger silences people who are more timid or are more reserved in what they have to say. I mean, just from the report that I wrote in 2019, I mean, I write a lot of stuff for the Center for Independent Studies. I can tell you that I have never had such a vitriolic response as I had to this paper. You know, regarding a country thousands of miles from where we live in this country, in a way concerning issues about which Australians have relatively little influence. The ire that it provoked was astonishing. And I don't think people like to be challenged, actually. And they were one of the things that made people particularly furious, and I had some pretty tough correspondence, was the idea that they felt that what they didn't like was the idea that they were defending the Palestinians. They thought that was the right thing to do. How could that possibly be anti-Semitic? And they had no regard for the international definition, for the line that is crossed between criticizing the government of Israel, which goodness knows, I mean, has always attracted criticism, vigorous criticism within Israel, whatever the complexion of the government. Moving from there to questioning the right of Israel to exist, or questioning the justice of things that the state of Israel was doing or representing. It provokes great anger and hostility, and I think that's one of the reasons why they're not challenged, and why that point of view prevails.
I just want to continue the theme a little bit of people being largely uneducated. A lot of the leftists are uneducated, and that's the worry. And I guess I want to ask you, is that happening in Australia? And I suppose the answer is probably yes. And we mentioned Bob Carr before, but that wouldn't apply to him. We couldn't say that he is uneducated about Israel. So how do we explain his anti-Semitism, and is Labor heading down this same road?
Well, there are two parts to that question. The first part of the question I can't answer. I don't know, because Carr is a highly intelligent, well-read, informed man. I just don't know. I just don't know. The second part is easier to answer. I don't think we yet face the sorts of threats that people within the Labour Party in Britain faced from, and Jewish members of Parliament faced from the reign of Corbyn. But it could happen, and I think we see the particular forms of anti-Semitism in certain parts of the Labour Party here. Often, I think those parts where there is a particular there's a particular influence from conservative Muslim communities, maybe in the western suburbs of Sydney, but also I think the Greens, as you've said before, who just strike me as being ignorant in so many respects, are deeply ignorant about Israel, and I think approach this with a very unthinking and unreflective attitude. And I have to say, I think another part of the answer is that the Palestinians have been over many years, even though they themselves are deeply divided and there are factions, as we know, the Palestinians have been very good at setting out the narrative, and they tell the story well. They tell the story in a way that captures the hearts and minds of people who don't know much about it. I'll just give you an interesting example, actually. When a few years ago, in the days when we could travel overseas, I was privileged to go on a tour of Israel. This was the last time I was in Israel with Adjunct. And as part of that tour, we went down to the Gaza Strip, not into, but up to the Gaza Strip and to Sturt. And it was at a time when missile attacks were taking place. It was actually very interesting because we could see what was going on the ground there. We were able to speak to some Israeli soldiers. And so we knew that Israel was responding to unprovoked attacks from Gaza, rockets launched by Hamas. It was fascinating to see how the BBC, which is another broadcasting organization with a problem with anti-Semitism, I think, how the BBC, how the ABC, how many international news outlets reported the news. You would think that Israel had deliberately set about waging war on Gaza, the idea that they were defending themselves from these unprovoked and unsolicited rocket attacks just was completely lost. And I think people believe what they see, and it's said often enough that the narrative becomes very plausible, and that's their point of view. That's their point of view.
Yeah. I'll just ask you one more quick question and then go to the audience, because we've got a lot of questions. The left seem to have hitched their wagon onto all things Islamic, and it's quite puzzling. You know, where are the feminists now that Afghanistan has fallen to the Taliban? Why does the gay community hate Israel when Israel is the only safe space for gay people? So how and why and when did this association between the left and Islam take place?
It probably has something to do with the rise of post-colonial fear, because Israel, for example, is regarded in the popular uninformed mind as white, Western, wealthy, pro-American. So everything that would attract the ire of somebody who was anti-colonial and anti-imperialist. The people who are deemed to be oppressed by Israel, who are the victims of Israel's alleged tyranny, are not white or Western or backed by the United States or representing an outpost of empire or colonialism. And so they are deemed to be the good people who warrant support, whereas Israel is deemed to be the collective bad guy that doesn't warrant support. And I think it's this very simplistic, bifurcated view of viewing the world, where things are analyzed into very simple, basic terms. Is something good or bad? Are you an oppressor or are you oppressed? Are you a perpetrator or are you a victim? And once that very basic, crude framework is applied, it becomes easy to take positions on a whole range of things. And as we know, for example, in climate change, which is a bit different, but the word denier is now used regularly, not just to say that to name somebody with whom you disagree. It's more than disagreement. It's about denial. You're denying a truth. You're denying something that is, well, yes, you're denying truth. And so it becomes disagreement. It becomes a contest of moral points of view. It's not just about intellectual engagement. So that's why I think the left has hitched its wagon, as it were, to the Islamic world. It was interesting to see Nancy Pelosi making that rather fatuous comment about women must be represented in certain levels of government in Afghanistan, as if Nancy Pelosi can do a damn thing about that. If you can forgive my language, but as if Nancy Pelosi can. It's enough to say it. Once it's said, and therefore she can be on the record as having said that and called for it. But it's completely unrealistic. I mean, it has to be said, of course, we're waiting to see whether we have old Taliban in a new form or whether it is a really sort of a Blairite new Taliban that has rethought its position over 20 years. We'll have to wait and see. But it seems to me to be very specious in a way to talk about the rights of women and the rights of lesbian and gay people in that sort of environment. And we can be sure that whilst things may be said, voices may be raised, there's not much that will be done about it.
Yeah, okay. Well, we'll have to wait and see. Okay, over to the audience. We've got Saul, Reuven and Anne are the first three. So Saul, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Well, thank you very much indeed for a most interesting talk. I think you're dead right with the whole thing about colonialism, and a good example of that I find that I'm really familiar with is South Africa, where in the liberation struggle you'd look hard to find a non-Jew or a non-Afrikaner. Most of the whites involved in the liberation struggle would be either Jews for the most part, plus a few Afrikaners. And yet when things changed completely, the reverse happened, and you get now the growth of anti-Semitism there. But I think it didn't happen just with a change. It happened before that. And I think it really started happening from 1967 onwards, And the big factor in it was that Jews internationally in Israel stopped acting as Jews were supposed to act and started acting a little differently, and that people found hard to accept. Their picture of the Jew had to change, and it didn't change for the better.
That's interesting. Yeah, Peter, what do you think? Was with the fact that Jews started winning wars, was that a factor in the way people changed?
Saul, I think that's a very important point, and I think the Six-Day War did change perceptions of Israel, and Israel became it became acceptable to see Israel as an aggressor, and land that was seized in a war that was not started by Israel suddenly became labeled as occupied territories, and the phrase occupied territories is still with us because it's deemed to be unlawful, unwarranted, against international law, or whatever criticism is made, to have taken land in a war, whereas in fact territory is often claimed in war. But Israel was not the aggressor. Israel fought against all the odds and was successful. And I think you're right. I think it was the beginning of a change in the way which Israel was perceived. It may have been before something that we had to put up with in the Middle East, but then it became a country that was prepared to stand up and fight for itself, and people took notice.
Thank you. Reuven, your turn. Please unmute yourself and ask your question. You're unmuted, Reuven, but we can't see you, but ask your question. No? Okay. We'll come back to you, Reuven. Anne, you can go next, so please unmute yourself.
Hello, Peter. It's
Hi, Anne.
where's Peter gone? Richard, it's really lovely to have you speak with us tonight.
Thank
you. It appears to have become whatever you want to call it, cool, trendy, fashionable, to openly express anti-Semitic tropes, and it has a shameless element to it. How can this be explained?
Well, because I think because of the way in which left-wing, what I call left-wing anti-Semitism has manifested itself, it becomes more acceptable to convey anti-Semitic ideas because they are seldom, if ever, directed at the explicit hatred of Jews. It's not about the explicit hatred of Jews. It's about we are told it's about resisting the tyrannous government of Israel. And because we're not speaking about individual Jewish people or Jewish communities, it becomes easier for criticism to slip over into anti-Semitism, and it becomes acceptable to talk about things in ways that are anti-Semitic, but they're not deemed to be anti-Semitic by those who put forward those points of view, because they would say, I've got nothing against Jewish people. In fact, a number of my critics wrote to say, how dare you call me anti-Semitic? I've been going to Israel for, so I have Jewish friends and so on and so forth. But it didn't stop them, or rather it prevented them from seeing that what they actually were doing was engaging in anti-Semitic discourse and saying things that were beyond the pale. But I think that's the real danger of left-wing anti-Semitism. It has this veil of respectability, which makes it not acceptable, but it becomes easier to say things that don't get challenged, which is why I think it's terribly important for people like Julian Burnside to be challenged in the way that they were challenged. I mean, I guess we all know what he was talking about. He was concerned about the plight of the Palestinians, and he thought that they were being treated unjustly and so on and so forth. But then he used the word Holocaust. And in that absurd and ignorant move, he crossed the line without, I think, even being aware of it, because what he thought he was doing was speaking up to defend the plight of the Palestinians. What he ended up doing was comparing the state of Israel to Nazi Germany and comparing what the government was doing to Hitler's Germany. And that is completely unacceptable. Thank goodness he was called out so vigorously and so swiftly, and from Jewish community, from Jewish organizations, but across the community, and many non-Jews spoke up to criticize what was said. That, I think, is what has to happen, and that is how we counter anti-Semitism. We call it out. I mean, without wanting to make my answer unduly long, Jeremy Corbyn used to say he just could not understand how he could possibly be anti-Semitic. He would say, "Oh, I've devoted my life to fighting racism," and because he regarded colonialism as a form of racism, and Israel as an expression of colonialism, and yet he'd fought racism all his life, he simply could not understand how what he was saying was anti-Semitic. And I think it was that stubborn blindness that caused Jeremy Corbyn and then the Labour Party a great deal of trouble. So that's how these things, that's why I think we hear more of it, because it's couched in terms that are not about hatred, but about, or overt hatred, but about justice, and who can be against justice.
Peter, I mean, somebody like Julian Burnside, who is prominent, he's a QC, he's very influential. Do you think he was surprised by the backlash? Well, and do you think that he might think that he can say things that other people wouldn't be able to?
I can't speak for Julian Burnside because I don't know him and I've never met him. My sense of this was that he was surprised, because Julian Burnside normally he normally captures the prevailing cultural winds, and I think he thinks I can imagine him thinking that if Burnside makes a pronouncement about something, then for the most part people are going to agree with him and accept it. But there was this tremendous and very strong and rapid blowback. What I don't know, and I haven't checked this, I mean, the Australian pounced on him, and other media outlets did the ABC? I don't know.
I don't know. No, well, okay. Reuven, let's try you again, and then we've got Gary, Andy, and Jeff. Reuven, please unmute yourself and ask your question. And just a reminder to keep questions short, please. I think Reuven's not with us tonight.
He deserted his post, yeah.
Okay, Gary, you can go next. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
I've got a broad brush historical question about this. Looking at the critical race theory, colonialist theories, all those contemporary theories, they all spring from human rights ideas, as though today's views of human rights are a new form of religion, of the ultimate morals that everything should be inherited from. When you look back across history, so many times when society is going through real radical changes, like the early Christianity, Jews are the scapegoats, where all of the bad sides of the previous morals are now piled onto Jews. And so today, with looking at that,
Gary, you'll have to get to your question, please.
Yeah, looking at that view of history, is there any real difference in the leftist ideas about Israel today against all of the news that's misreporting Jews? I hope the question is somewhere in there was clear.
Of course, all anti-Semitic discourse that involves Israel can only have happened after 1948, of course, and so it has mutated in a particular way in the last 70 or 80 years. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the Jews have always been a scapegoat for one thing or another, and when people seek to allocate blame or responsibility for things when they go wrong, it's usually laid at the feet of Jewish people and Jewish communities. And one thing we haven't actually mentioned is this talk about the Jewish lobby, the so-called Jewish lobby that is supposed to be, which is a new manifestation of an old trope about Jewish money and Jewish influence controlling everything in the world. I just like to read a quote from the late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who had this to say about anti-Semitism, which I think, Gary, goes directly to the heart of your question, because the forms of anti-Semitism change, and it mutates a bit like a virus. We know lots about viruses at the moment, but at the heart of it, Sachs said that anti-Semitism exists and is dangerous whenever two contradictory factors appear in combination. The first is the belief that Jews are so powerful that they are responsible for the evils of the world, and the knowledge that they are so powerless that they can be attacked with impunity. And I think Sachs captures that really beautifully there, this thing very powerfully. See, either Jews are powerful and responsible for everything, or they are so weak and powerless that they can be blamed for everything. And once you have that basic framework, you can apply it to any situation in human history, I think.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Andy is in Israel, and I think that's Elkan next to her, so hi to you. So Andy, please, you're unmuted, so please ask your question.
Thank you. I've lived in Israel for 15 years, and I've learned that words make a difference. When people say occupied territories, it gives the person the idea that Israel stole the property, where it's actually Judah and Samaria. And then before the land of Israel, it was the British Mandate. It was the Turkish Ottoman Empire. And yet people referred to the land before Israel as the Palestinian land. And I think since we use the words incorrectly, it does cause anti-Semitism. And I'd like to know what your thought is. Thank you.
I agree with you, Andy. I think it's an example of the way in which a narrative is developed and repeated and takes hold. Because, I mean, you're right. And I think this is one of the real problems, that people who think they're defending the Palestinians, one of the problems that their defense shows up is a profound ignorance of history. There is this idea, this myth that is perpetrated and perpetuated, that there was a nation that Israel uprooted and displaced and now seeks to destroy in the course of its own national life. And yet that's not the case at all. And the home of the Palestinians was Jordan, that notably does not want to offer the people of Palestine a homeland. But there is this idea that has taken hold that people were displaced unjustly and without any kind of warrant. And that is a story that is very, very hard to dislodge. But I agree with you. I think one of the things that, in my view, the left is able to do very well, and it does it in any debate that you care to name, whether it's racism, whether it's about gender or sexual identity, or as what's happening in Australia, debates about euthanasia and the legalization of euthanasia, the left changes the language. So to take the example of euthanasia, it's no longer euthanasia, it was physician-assisted suicide. Then that's changed again to be voluntary assisted dying. And I think the language is always being changed to fit an evolving narrative. And I think that has definitely happened in the recounting of the history of Israel and Palestine. There are myths that are perpetuated that it's very difficult to challenge. Even, people, fine scholars and columnists spend a great deal of energy trying to correct that misuse of language. It's very hard to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Jeff, your turn, and then Ron.
Shalom. I hear that earlier you said that you're puzzled as to why Jews don't make a better effort at defending themselves against Jew hatred. But the answer is within that scenario, because it takes 10 times as long to compose a defense against the one-line anti-Semitic jibe that it actually takes a lot of effort to compose an answer that is short and quick, like I try to be at times. However, I have a solution, and what do you think of it? When the left gets done over as a result of Biden and all his machinations, maybe that will change a few things to debunk and diminish the left's power, particularly in the States. What do you think of that?
Well, I would hope that's the case. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how likely that is to happen, because it seems to me, I mean, one of the traits of left-wing ideology and left-wing activism is that whatever happens, the left somehow claims that it's victorious and has succeeded. But Jeff, I'd like to think you were right. I think we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned Biden, just to say quickly with Biden. Imagine if Trump, I mean, I know that there's now commentators and political scientists are debating amongst themselves whether or not Biden was simply implementing Trump's policy or what happened there. But imagine if Trump had pulled out of Afghanistan with the scenes that we've seen this week, rather than Biden. I mean, the left-wing media would have been all over Trump. We would have never heard the end of it. I'm not sure he's going to get away with it, but I think criticism from the left has been muted.
Yeah. Okay, Ron, fire away, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
Good evening. Hello. A lot of the the left-wing anti-Semitism comes from academia, especially in places like the United States. And when it does occur, the university chancellors usually have very kind of watery responses. These universities are very, very dependent on donors from philanthropists. What would happen if organizations that are dealing with anti-Semitism like that would confront these philanthropists and donors and tell them that they are directly and indirectly funding anti-Semitism, and it could be made public? Would this change the equation?
Well, I don't know, Ron. The donors would probably deny that they were being anti-Semitic and that they were just speaking up in the name of justice for a cause that warranted their support. I don't know how easy it is to come between a university and a huge sum of money. I mean, we're seeing that play out to an extent here. I mean, it's gone a bit quiet in the last couple of years, but the extent to which Chinese money was buying influence in universities, and many vice chancellors stood hard against the idea that they were somehow being subverted by Chinese influence, even when there was evidence to the contrary. So I don't know, but I think you're right that a lot of it, certainly in Australia, a lot of it is happening on university campuses. My friend Suzanne Rutland has been somebody who over the years has really helped me to understand the extent to which anti-Semitism plays out on the university campus, and of course in her own work in high schools as well, which is actually rather more alarming even than what goes on university campuses. Philanthropists would deny that they were taking a stand, but I think raising the question and protesting against these sorts of donors is a very important thing to do. It seems to be a very important moral stand to take, because certainly any money that comes from a family that has even a taint of association with slavery is now called into question. Maybe the taint of anti-Semitism needs to be people need to draw attention to the taint of anti-Semitism much more readily, and see that it's actually unacceptable to take money from people who are overtly anti-Semitic.
Yes, let's hope so. Bill Rizopoulos, one of our very supportive Christian Zionist friends, is next. So Bill, please unmute yourself, and then we'll have Elaine.
Peter, thanks very much for your presentation, and I'm really happy that the AJA had you on tonight. The International Christian Embassy is dedicated to the sovereignty of the State of Israel and the Jewish identity. And I had I've got a question that I've been pondering at least this year in regards to the early church fathers, which I know might be right up your alley. Do you think, in your view, have you had a chance to look at those condemning statements that are quite often brought up in Jewish circles about anti-Semitism? And do you think that quite often they are not quoted in context? Do you think the waters are muddied in that area? I know, at least in my view, I've seen a couple of instances where I thought, well, geez, that really needs to be teased out a little bit more because it's quite unfair. Have you been able to cast your mind in that area?
When you say statements, do you mean statements that are made today, or the reading of statements from another age?
Oh no, I'm talking about the early church fathers. I'm from a similar tradition to you, where the Eastern Orthodox tradition does respect the early church fathers of the first, second, and third century, and there were some anti-Semitic statements that perhaps weren't quite in context. Sorry for the difficult question. I thought maybe that you may.
No, it's a good question, because I think that the churches, the Christian churches, have become in the last, I don't know, let's say maybe since the Second World War, and maybe the Holocaust was the key precipitating factor here. But I think the Christian churches, for the most part, across the board, are now coming to terms with what has been at times a very, very unsatisfactory relationship with Jews and Judaism. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, has recently taken it upon himself to apologize for the church's treatment of the Jews. And I think theologians rather, have worked very hard to understand some of these texts and not to explain them away, but I think to sift out, as it were, the things that are genuinely anti-Semitic from those that are cultural expressions that we would say now are unacceptable. And we know that, you know, even in Christian scriptures, some of the New Testament writings in the Christian scriptures, such as the Gospel of John, are difficult to read because of what appears to be an overt anti-Semitism. And I think scholars have worked very hard and still work hard to reconcile some of the statements in Christian scriptures with what is now deemed to be a completely unacceptable attitude towards Jewish people and Judaism. And it's one of the reasons why I think it's extremely important for groups like the Council of Christians and Jews to meet together, to come to common understanding, and to be able to share questions and air areas of concern. History is what it is, and I think one of the challenges is to live with what's happened. The question is not so much whether we can undo what has happened, but whether we're able to live with and learn from what has happened.
Absolutely. Elaine, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Is that it? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Peter.
Hi, Elaine. Nice to see you.
Lovely to see you, likewise. I've just been preempted there. I wanted to bring the church into this discussion. So you, as you will well know, the Church of England is considering a public act of repentance at the 2022 Oxford Synod next year to commemorate the Synod of 800 years ago, 1222, which fueled anti-Semitic sentiment, leading to the expulsion of the Jews from England in 1290, I think it was. The Anglican Church says that medieval church laws paved the way for the Holocaust. Now, at the same time, replacement theology is a growing movement amongst some churches, like the Methodist Church in the UK, which is jumping onto the BDS bandwagon.
Elaine, you'll need to get to your question.
Yes. Is this a modern reincarnation of medieval anti-Semitism? So what responsibility do you think lies with some of the church organizations?
Well, that's a really good question. I think BDS is a new manifestation of anti-Semitism that deliberately targets not just Jewish businesses, but is in any country, but the boycotting of Israeli academics and associations with Israel. Again, the defenders of BDS that do include some of the NGOs that we were talking about earlier, and the leaders of some of the Christian churches would say that they would deny they were being anti-Semitic. They were just standing up for a principle of justice. But the BDS is easily sold to the unsuspecting as simply about, not buying Jaffa oranges or something. But in fact, if you dig down and look at the aims of the organization, it goes far, far beyond economic sanctions. They have a political goal, which in my view amounts to not overthrowing in a revolutionary sense, but undermining the existence of the state of Israel. Well, if that's not anti-Semitic, I don't know what is. So I think that, this is again the danger that we have to be alert to, that people participate in these activities, and if they're not well informed, they'll think they're doing the right thing, or they'll think they're making a stand for justice, but actually they've crossed the line and they're engaging in behavior, and they're peddling lies that are completely unacceptable.
Yes, look, we're coming up to time, so apologies to Leon and Marilyn. We like to finish close to time. Peter, I just want to thank you so much for joining us. It's a fascinating discussion, and you've introduced some really good ideas. It's been a very enlightening, if somewhat worrying analysis, but I want to thank you for all your excellent work. Just before I hand back to David, I'll mention that following us in a couple of moments is Morris Klein on radio station 3ZZZ with L'chaim, 92.3 FM or 3ZZZ.com.au. Just before I leave you, Peter, has Julian Burnside invited you over for a cup of tea yet?
Well, even if he had done, I wouldn't be able to get there because I live in Sydney, and in severely locked down Sydney, and he's in Melbourne. But no, he hasn't. Okay. I'm just going to hand back to David for some final housekeeping, and then we'll say goodbye to everybody.
Okay, look, thank you so much, Peter, for a very interesting discussion. One of the things that inspired you in this direction you mentioned was Bob Carr, and I noticed that he was a subject in some chat. So I'm going to share with you some information on the public record in case you are not aware. The Crescent Foundation is an Islamic charity operating in Australia. It's associated with Crescent Wealth, which is the Sharia compliant superannuation fund in Australia. If we click here on team, you have a look at directors, team and ambassadors. The board is now chaired by the Professor Bob Carr. Now, I just think that's interesting that he has a formal appointment associated with Islamic money, and whether that is of any influence or not, I'll leave it to others to speculate. But it's an interesting association, which is now on the record. So the final thing to do before we sign off is to make a sort of a non-announcement, but it's an important non-announcement as to what's happening next week. For only the second time in the history of this organisation, we are applying additional security with regard to our guest next week. Let me just say that again, it is a very high level government representative, and this is one certainly not to be missed, and we will have our additional security arrangements for the event next week. So Peter, thank you very much, and thank you. Sign off.
Okay, thanks Peter, thanks David, and thank you to everybody for joining us. We'll look forward to seeing you again next week with a very interesting guest, but until then, it's good night to you all. Have a great week. Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.